what I'm going to try and do is to broaden the debate that we've had thus far and just try and look at some of the issues that we are looking at today, actually through that lens of history. This isn't a new problem, and I'll repeat that loads of times. It's a problem that we have confronted or failed to confront in slightly different chemical compositions, in slightly different contexts, in slightly different scales, but we keep coming back to the problem of air pollution and our failure to properly deal with it using the knowledge that we have. And we do not have a deficit of knowledge. Ian has introduced our conference today with a very succinct summary of the overwhelming power of the evidence base. And what are we doing with it? We're talking about it. Where is the action? And I want to come back to the point about action at several points in what I hope won't be too much of a rant, but I'm really, really cross about the circumstances we find ourselves in. I'm glad that Ian was cross as well, but slightly more reserved than slightly at risk of having drunk too much coffee, and therefore feeling even more angry than I should be. So let's just tell you what I'm going to try and do. I'm going to try and look at the lens that history provides to tell us something about where we've been and why we haven't done what we should have done. And I'll do it with the benefit of 2020 hindsight. That's, of course, a wonderful position to adopt. And it enables you to look at things in a way that perhaps wasn't possible at the time you were actually doing it. And I'll bring it back at the end to the question of why are we failing to manage air quality? Why are we failing to manage air quality? Because, in my opinion, and please disagree with me in the questions, I think we are failing. We are failing badly. And we don't, I'm going to be pessimistic now, Roger, I don't think there is a lot of optimism about taking this issue forward. I hope you will prove me wrong by telling me that I'm being rather pessimistic. Let's just go back to classical times. This is not a new problem. Those of you who wish to read some Latin can find Horace describing the air pollution of Rome. Not alone. And you could go through history, stopping off at various points in time, that will tell you that we observed air pollution, tutted about air pollution, and didn't really do a lot. You can look at images like this and images like that and say, isn't it great? We managed the air pollution in those images. Well, did we? Or was it economic change that actually led to the change in the concentrations of smoke and sulfur dioxide in circumstances like that? Roger mentioned that I spent some time in Manchester. That was known as Cottonopolis in the 19th century. And at that time, smoke pollution was seen as a virile symbol of laissez-faire capitalism and was actually described in such terms by a range of different commentators. Things like this from the middle of the last century and like this were in the lived experience of some in the room here. They are no longer the case in quite the terms that those symbols and those images suggest. But we have different problems and different challenges. And have we learnt the lessons of history? Were there warnings that we could have taken from the evidence base? And could we have done something different? And with the knowledge we now have, can we do something different today? Just refer back to the evidence base that Ian presented at the beginning of the conference. An overwhelming set of evidence that suggests public health is grossly affected by air pollution that prevails today. I've been taken by John Evelyn's work, just as Ian has. John Evelyn told us all we need to know about pollution control. In the middle of the 17th century, he identified the principles of pollution control. The problem was vested interests enabled those fine observations to fail to come to fruition. It was without doubt a holistic understanding of air pollution control. Unfortunately, it got very, very limited attention for the next 200 or so, 250 years, apart from in some interesting university conversations. It was without doubt an early warning that we paid attention to. And I should acknowledge that in using the early warning phrase, I am paraphrasing some great work the European Environment Agency did a decade or so ago in publications called Late Lessons from Early Warnings. I'm just phrasing the warnings bit. Maybe you'll take the lessons. Now, those of you in the room who know Robert Angus Smith, put your hand up. People from UWE are associated with UWE are not allowed to. Yeah, Robert Angus Smith, probably the most famous person in air pollution you've never heard of. He was the person who, without doubt, was the founder of the environmental science tradition, the father of acid rain, because what he did was set up in the 1850s to 1870 period the first European monitoring networks. He established the causes of acid precipitation and urban air pollution. He identified all the impacts from vegetation, building damage through to health. He recommended a range of pollution control measures. He was actually in an influential position because he was the chief inspector under the Alkali Acts. Unfortunately, all of the fine warnings that Robert Angus Smith was able to bring forward failed to really make the difference that one might hope. And then if we just come forward into the earlier part of the last century, everybody is familiar with the 1952 smog in London. There was an early warning that people paid little attention to. In Manchester in 1931 and in Salford, its sister city, a very substantial and significant smog event led to a very substantial increase in death over a relatively short period of time. It led to the ideas of smokeless zones and a whole range of other initiatives that what became the National Society for Clean Air took forward at the time. But at that time, very little heed was taken of that early warning. There are other early warnings. This is a lovely image. It's an illustration of traffic congestion, not in reality, but a lithograph, I think it would have been, called The Illustration of Modern Prophecy. If you're unfamiliar, have a look at it if these slides are circulated. There's lots of other images like that. But there were warnings of things to come. These images just show that traffic was not a surprise increasing in number, or, as the rather stylized image at the bottom right shows, the potential impacts on children through exposure to vehicle emissions. But when we think about vehicle emissions, let's not forget, in other parts of the world, there are still traditional air pollution problems that are profound. This is some images in Durban in South Africa where there are some very profound health implications. What you can't see on the slide is there's a school just off here where that stack discharges straight into the playground. There are some profound issues to deal with. This image that's partly cut off, Santiago in Chile, just a classical smog from that part of the world. Here's a couple of images I really like. Some of you will have heard of the no play days in Beijing. Here's an image of a play day in Beijing, and the same image. You know, we've got some serious issues in other parts of the world. There's a traffic component in that. There's a Gobi Desert component in that. There's a lot of coal smoke and other rather nasty compounds in there as well. But it is a no play outside day, so that's quite good. You're inside, exposed to all the internal air pollution problems, which can be quite profound. But of course it's a problem here and now in Bristol. It doesn't look like Beijing, but we have our air quality management area. You're actually in it. It's been here for a long time. It's been part of the programme of work in the United Kingdom that started with the Environment Act in 1995, the first air quality strategy in 97, a few more of them going forward. We were meant to have dealt with NO2, which is the cause of the declaration of this air quality management area, in 2005. That's a decade ago, in case you hadn't twigged. And we are still with a large-scale air quality management area, principally derived from our traffic conditions. And it's not just us, it's lots of other local authorities. I won't go into the detail. The graph that we stopped drawing this in a couple of years ago, this is local authorities with air quality management areas. A number of you will be familiar with it. It just keeps growing. And I understand that for the last couple of years, when we stopped drawing it, it's continued to increase in number. It's not getting any better, at least in terms of a regulatory requirement in the United Kingdom. And we know it's a cause of death. Let's not pretend that it isn't contributing to premature death. PM 2.5, the estimate is 29,000 premature deaths. Okay, that's pretty precise, but it may be more, it may be less. We now have the estimate of 23,500 deaths from nitrogen dioxide. That's around about 52,000 deaths in total from those two pollutants alone. Whether they are the cause, whether they are the carrying agents, just a surrogate for other things, further work will have to tell us. But what is the case is that we have very clear medical evidence about premature death. We know from the World Health Organization around 7 million people died as a result of exposure to air pollution in the report in 2012. About 3.7 million attributable to ambient air pollution, and that's a doubling of the estimates that had previously been made by the WHO. And it basically is saying that outdoor pollution kills more people than smoking, road deaths, and diabetes. And I quote that from the WHO. That's not me. That's a direct lift from the report. And the causes of death, Ian has covered this, they are considerable. It's stroke and heart disease, lung disease, and cancers. Those percentages will probably vary from country to country, from region to region, but those are causes of premature death. Now, costs seem to make people excited. It may be something that will change our thinking about doing something. The WHO, using a method of willingness to pay, which has some challenges, let's not ignore those, but an estimate of cost in European economies every year, it's 1.6 trillion US dollars in disease and death. That's the costs that they have estimated using a particular methodology. I can find a statement that the UK national debt total, not every year, total, is 2.55 trillion US dollars. So let's say the WHO estimates about half the cost, and that's for European economies, but about half the cost. But it's every year in European economies. And we all got terribly excited about the Greek debt. Now, the data that I can find says that was about 422 billion US dollars. So that just puts things, at least in my mind, in a comparison. Now, whether those are fair, I don't know, but they are numbers that might influence some people's behavior. And the WHO have also brought forward the definition of a Class 1 carcinogen for air pollution. Ambient air pollution, a Class 1 carcinogen, which is serious, and Ian will underscore the seriousness of that, I'm sure. So if health doesn't change the way in which we have chosen to act about air pollution, is the law going to do anything for us? Well, you will all, I suspect, to some extent, be aware of the legal opinions and decisions that have happened. The Supreme Court in the United Kingdom ruled earlier this year about the breach of the Air Quality Directive and insisted that we move to a plan, and we'll hear about that later in the conference. But 15 years ago, the air quality strategy that was to improve air quality in the United Kingdom said, as you've now read, clean air is an essential ingredient of a good quality of life. People have the right to expect the air they breathe will not harm them. Now, one could disentangle that. It didn't say it was an absolute requirement of a good quality of life, because you don't live very long without air, but the right to expect is not the same thing as the right to enjoy, but it's on the way to being a powerful statement. We could have written it a little more powerfully, but it's a good statement of intent. And then the European Court of Justice in 2008 confirmed the enforceable right in Europe to clean air for all EU citizens. It was in relation to particulate matter, but it is an enforceable right to clean air. So the question in my mind is, how are we going to enforce that right in the circumstances we now find ourselves in? Defra is consulting. You will, in many instances in this room, you will be familiar with the consultation that is in direct relationship to our failure to meet the directive. All of you I would encourage to make your representations. I would simply ask that will the clean air zones that are proposed, will they actually deal with the issue? Is the underpinning science sufficient to give you confidence that those zones will be the magic bullet that deals with the air pollution problem? I didn't see anything, and I may not have read to the depth I should have done in the consultation documents, but I didn't see new powers. I may have missed that. I didn't see financial resources. I may have missed that. Was that an adequate set of responses to the challenge that has been presented by the air pollution that exists here and now, and we appear very happy to live with outside of this room? Now, I'm not going to pretend that this isn't a highly complex issue with lots of confounding variables. I'll just say this is complex, and I understand why there are loads of reasons that can be presented, why the evidence base isn't yet sufficient, why the modelling can't really get there. Oh, look at the problem we have with emission factors. They're not really we need to do more work before we can take any action. Well, is that going to be sufficient? There is a media interest. It's good to hear that the media are in the room today. There is some public interest. The WHO figures that I quoted earlier gained quite a bit of traction, although they seem to have disappeared in the recent conversations about Volkswagen. Some of you will be familiar with Chai Jing's viral documentary, Under the Dome. If you haven't seen that, do have a look. That got quite a lot of attention. It's an hour and a half, 2 hour expose of air pollution in China. Absolutely fascinating. It got a huge amount of attention, but that then seems to have attenuated. So maybe it's time for it to come back. Now, I had to mention the VW scandal. I hear from The Guardian that a member of the board of Volkswagen described it as a criminal action. They deliberately set out to deceive. That's very, very serious. But will this be a public health issue, or will it be the consumer rights issue that becomes the dominant discourse about this issue? I know which I'm going to bet on. So, moving to the end of what I hope hasn't been too much of a rant, although I am, to re-emphasise, quite cross about the way in which we have failed to deal with the air pollution issues we know we could deal with. I argue we choose air pollution. Some people we impose air pollution on, but there is a choice. And a choice often born out of ignorance or a deliberate choice. We can make choices that are based on ignorance. But air pollution problems have been inescapable partners of our economic development, and they've been around a long time. It's a consequence of political, economic, and societal choices and available technology acting together. And air pollution has a dynamic relationship with those issues. Our social and economic responses to air pollution often lag behind our awareness and our understanding of the impact, and that, I would argue, is particularly true in the run-up to this conference. The public's willingness to accept a particular amount of pollution changes over time. At points in time, the public has been very exercised about air pollution problems, and at other points, economic issues have dominated their concerns. And the ability of our institutions of government and civil society to tackle air pollution actually varies with that public concern. The economic costs are, of course, important. The impacts of air pollution tend to be a subordinate issue in those conversations. And, of course, the availability of technology drives some of the response. So, I ask you, do we want to change? We appear, in my judgment at least, to choose air pollution. It follows that we can choose to minimize the effects of air pollution. But I ask you, do we want to change? So thank you very much indeed.
Duncan Laxon of Air Quality Consultants. Thank you, Jim, for your presentation. I've been around a little bit longer than yourself in the air quality field, and I've also mused on occasions as to what we can learn from the history. I think my analysis is that 4 things are required to bring about change. One is we need to have legislation in place. Another is that we need to have the technology to bring about that change. But then we need public support or campaigning to encourage that change to happen. And also we need elements of financial support. And when I've looked at it in that context, we can start with smoke and sulfur dioxide, where we had all 4 of those components that played a part. Largely, it was probably the technology to convert from coal burning to gas burning that did it, and there was financial support for that. But prior to that, there had been campaigns, and there was the Clean Air Act legislation. And the other example is lead pollution, which I was very concerned about in my early career. There was a campaign against lead in air that was a very strong campaign, but that was then supported by technology, which was the catalytic converter that required lead-free fuel to make it work in practice. But there was also financial support in that lead-free fuel was more expensive to produce, but it was subsidized so that it was the same price as leaded fuel. And on the back of that, with the catalytic converter, we had the technology that improved our benzene and carbon monoxide concentrations in a big way. So I think if you have those elements there, you can make changes. Whether or not we've got them there for the current problems we have, which to a large extent are to do with nitrogen dioxide and diesel vehicles, is a little bit unclear. The legislation in principle is in place, but its enforcement has not been very good, and that's the manufacturers and also the EU member states who've not really dealt with making sure that the testing regime is realistic and adhered to. So there's guilty parties there. The public support and campaigning side has been weak over the last 10 years, really. There's not a strong campaign other than perhaps Simon Burkitt in London, who's a one-man campaign. And financial support has, at the moment, been acting against improving the diesel situation. So changes can be learnt, well, ways to move forward can be learnt from history, and we need to now apply those to the current problem that we have.
Thank you, Duncan. If I could just add one part to that by way of emphasis, and that is enforcement. You did touch upon it, but legislation does need to be enforced. And I will say that again, legislation needs to be enforced. We've had quite a lot of quite appropriate legislation. What we haven't always had is the form of enforcement that will drive the change that the scientific evidence base identifies as being necessary. And what that often requires is resources at the point at which enforcement is most appropriately directed. And if I come back to where we appear to be in the consultation document for the clean air zones in the Defra consultation, there doesn't appear to be resource and support that will enable enforcement. I hope I've misread the documentation, and I look forward to being corrected if I have. But at the moment, I don't see it. And I think enforcement is critical to the next stage. And there is a role for local authorities as enforcement agents. The failure of our attempts in the last 20 years to manage air quality might be because the way the legislation was written did not enable local authorities to enforce the objectives set in various parts of UK law. It only gave them an obligation to work towards doing something about them, which is really quite a poor phrasing of an intent. Local authorities can be key actors for change. They have been in the past. Many of the instances of air pollution image that I showed earlier, actually local authorities were the drivers for change in parallel with civic society. And we need to re-energize those relationships and to make the changes that public health demands on the back of those relationships.